Welcome to the State of Cybersecurity Industry panel series. We are proud to bring together decades of cybersecurity experience from world-class experts, executives, and strategic advisors. We will explore the present and future of cybersecurity evolution, talk about compliance and regulation, best practices, emerging threats, and the impact on the IoT and OT device market.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Evgeniy, and I'll be the moderator for today's State of Cybersecurity Industry panel, brought to you by Cybits. Today's topic is very important. We're talking about software transparency in aviation infrastructure. I didn't fly for 2 years, so I want to fly, but meanwhile, I want to talk about aviation and software transparency. We have amazing 3 guests today with a lot of experience in the industry, and I would like to welcome Tony Coyle, Chief Technology Officer at Attivo Networks.
Hi, Evgeniy. Thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it. And, just quick background on myself. This is a critical, important field. So, and one that really requires a focus from everybody in the cybersecurity industry today. So I'm happy to be here and discuss this topic.
Thank you. Dr. Chris Wood, Lockheed Martin Fellow.
Good morning. Glad to be joining you today from Lockheed. I've been involved with the aviation world for more years than I care to count at the moment. Let's just say more than 20. And I'm happy to be here and talk about software transparency.
Thank you, Chris. Michael Yelland, Chief Security Research Officer at Rovinai.
Hi, afternoon, guys. So my name is Mike Yelland. Industry well over 20 years. Aviation is one of many transportation industries that pulls my focus, primarily around the critical infrastructure and the impact it can have. So look forward to today's talk.
Thank you. Transparency in aviation infrastructure is fundamental to the safety and reliability of modern travel. As software has become critical to aviation safety and reliability, the need for similar transparency has become more evident. Today, we will discuss the introduction of software bill of materials, or SBOMs, to support our shared interest in the safe and reliable aviation infrastructure. It's a live show, so please write your questions. We will make sure to answer them in the end. We have several topics to discuss today, and we will begin with topic number 1. So our first topic, it will go to Chris, and we would like to understand more. With so many years of experience, what do you see the changes in software transparency and some of the ongoing trends you see in the market as well?
Well, I've got to say that in the past 3 or 4 decades, I've seen enormous changes as far as software transparency goes in the aviation industry, both as a pilot and as a working in the actual aviation industry itself. Some of the changes that I've seen are centered around the visibility of the software that you are delivering or providing to your customers or receiving from your suppliers. And for many years, it was closely held secret for the most part, unless your customer demanded some insight into software that you were using. And that has changed a lot over the last 20 years. We introduced and I helped develop a system that provided the customers with a preliminary SBOM, which was primarily centered around the open source components and the licensing that went with those components. So that was probably the first time that I saw any change. And then as we moved more and more into the agile development world, it's kind of taken software transparency along with it. And in the last 5 to 8 years, with the advent of the DevSecOps movement, We've seen more and more as we've introduced new technologies and tools into the build process. And that goes for both the general aviation population as well as for commercial aviation and manufactured for the government.
Is there a difference between commercial, private, from social transparency perspective? I'm wondering if there's a different ways to introduce it or different demand.
A lot of the glass cockpits that we use in commercial aviation are the same that are being used by our commercial carriers as well as in our general aviation airplanes. So the amount of information that is displayed to the pilots now is a lot more organized than it used to be when you just looked at round dials that kind of gave you a status of how something was doing, regardless of whether it was software driven or not. Now you actually can get some detailed information into what's going on inside your fuel flow or whatever system that you happen to be looking at just by pushing a few buttons on the systems that monitor that. And that's available to both commercial and general aviation pilots as well as the military. Heads-up displays back 20, 30 years ago, those were pretty much exclusively assigned to military aircraft. And as they became cheaper and cheaper, they evolved to commercial aviation, and you can now get a HUD in your Corvette if you want, or your Cadillac. So there has been quite a change. As far as SBOMs go, I think that there was kind of a movement going on about generating SBOMs before the executive order came out, but it's took a serious leap forward, and with numerous players trying to get into the market in generating SBOMs, I think that at some point we're going to have to stop and evaluate how much of that information is really necessary, because right now when you dump an SBOM report out in SPDX format or whatever format you happen to be using, if it's a JSON dump, unless it's properly formatted, it's pretty unintelligible to the average reader. And I don't see how it's going to do them much good. And I think there's too much information in there from a manufacturer's perspective. You don't always want to share everything that you've got in your code package. And that goes for commercial aviation as well. I think that things like FlightAware have really shown us that there are things that are going on which may be excessive as far as flight tracking and things like that. For example, when I'm flying my airplane, I don't particularly want Johnny or Susie knowing that I'm flying my airplane from Dallas, Texas to Cincinnati in Ohio. It's just, yeah. Anyway, so I think that there are things that we're going to have to look at within the whole SBOM reporting methodology and decide how it's going to be reported and where it's going to be reported, especially where it relates to the security aspects of the software that you're using. For example, there are medium and low grade vulnerabilities in some pieces of open source software that can be mitigated because of how you're using them. But do you really want everybody and their mother to know that there is a vulnerability there, and here's the CVE and the other information that's available about that, so that somebody can try to figure out how they can exploit it? So I think it needs to have a serious look, and that's my personal opinion.
Tony, Michael, anything to add here?
I was going to say he hits on a really critical piece. I mean, SBOMs in theory are a great thing. It comes down to how practical are they. So, when you have a green field and you have the luxury of generating an SBOM of all the things that are going to be installed in there, that's great. The security implications typically come on in integrations or upgrades or changeovers. We saw a lot of that with multimedia systems being added to commercial flights. That wouldn't have been captured in an original SBOM. That was an after-the-fact retrofit. So if you can't get the information out of SBOMs to be usable for vendors, right, and look at the system in a complete form, then we're only going to have SBOMs of these little silos that all interconnect. And that typically is where we have our shortcoming, is that interconnectivity. Great that we identified a vulnerability there, But if we're leaving lowering hanging fruit for those interoperability pieces, such as media terminals to cabin, media terminals to flight controls, which was the theory, then we're not really making anything better. We're generating paperwork.
Yeah. Great. So you mentioned about commercial space. Is it actually necessary to have a software transparency in the commercial space? And Tony, I would like to drag this question to you.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. I think the SBOM movement is important and really critical for us to understand our vulnerabilities, the provenance of our software. What pieces are in that software. I agree with everything Michael and Chris said as well, but if we've got interconnected systems that are externally accessible or accessible, in a relatively easy fashion for an insider, then we have significant issues, and that piece can be very, very powerful to help. I think the Log4j vulnerability, which is a couple people working on some software that was included pretty much worldwide in many enterprises, was a really big wake-up call for people understanding the implications of using open source software and not understanding where it's coming from. So I think that's an important piece to think about. When you apply this directly to commercial space systems, we're in the infancy right now of what we're going to see for connectivity in space systems. I mean, just in the last 2 years, it's been absolutely phenomenal, the amount of investment and focus in space systems, in connectivity. If you look, there's some work being done today on space-based laser communication systems to eliminate much of the lag in the communications we have today. You look at the aerospace side, you've got Starlink now trying to work with the airlines and provide high-speed connectivity to every airline out there. And we're only now just starting to see the whole space tourism component take off, where we're going to see lots and lots of effort in low Earth orbit, where there's a lot more satellites up there, there's a lot more consumers traveling up there. So as vacations, that gets cheaper and cheaper. So as we interconnect those systems, it's critically important from a safety perspective to really understand, what could potentially happen if there's a vulnerability in some of the code included in your code that you're not aware of. So I think when we look at those pieces, we really have to look at this and build a good structure for identifying the problems that may be inherent in something we've bought and simply not aware of it.
Is there any guidelines in the aviation space or space if I can use open software or not? Or I have to create everything in-house?
There's a lot of guidelines that are laid out there today, and you really have to look at it. There was a great paper on, I'm trying to remember where I read that, AIA. So it was AIA Aerospace. They had a great paper laid out there, and they talked about the problems with not only the software, but the hardware pieces as well, and suppliers. And they broke it into, different segments to try and solve this problem. Really fascinating read. And they talked about, organizations outside of, the aerospace or space systems structure that are providing software from a commercial perspective. So like my company and many, many others do as well. And then people also, look at software that's developed, by aerospace, by manufacturers, and those, in the space system as well. And breaking those down separately is really, really important, because as Michael pointed out, you can take some of that software today, you can bring it into a system, and if you're not going to expose that, to the internet, and you can put mitigations in place for insider threat, then it may not be that much of a problem. The standards today, though, are certainly not close to keeping up with, the exploration, and explosion of space, and as well as in the aerospace world today. Things are changing dramatically as we speak. I just saw a guy I've worked with in the past who just left Airbus and now is actually CEO of a new autonomous helicopter division, so of a company. So it's a rapidly changing world, rapidly changing.
Chris, Michael, anything you want to add on the topic?
No, I completely agree with Tony. As far as the evolution and the speed that we're going at is faster than what we've seen in the last 20 years, to be honest. Just in the last 5-10 years, we've seen massive changes in technology. And really the SBOM from a commercial standpoint, or really anything, it's another way of doing risk assessments. And we failed in that in IT. So my concern when we come with a new philosophy of this is who's going to own that SBOM? Is it going to be IT? Is it be the engineers? Will it be the vendors? Hybrid of both? And then you have to tie the pieces together. This D-Link plugs into this firewall, or this plugs into the other. So will that generate additional SBOMs, or should we start looking at SBOMs more of a full system when it comes to things like aviation, space, transportation, where I may have a perfect SBOM for this one application generated by this aviation manufacturer in-house, and then I'm going to tie it to some open source that's approved or not, right? Or maybe another manufacturer's software. And is there going to be interoperability issues there, or are we going to deprecate to the lowest form of security, which is historically kind of how we've handled these things? So my big question is literally, and it's something that I'm always digging into, is SBOM just a reinvention of something that we failed at previously, and we still have to find owners? And then also, to a previous point, once the data is in there, we got to get the data out to where it's meaningful for people. Otherwise, it's an inventory, right?
Yeah, we used to have a software acquisition analysis tools, but unfortunately, they didn't work with everyone, and it required a lot of access.
Excel.
Yeah.
Evgeniy, if I could add to what Michael just stated, one of the things that we have to continuously think about in this field, and quite frankly, many of the fields in the connected world we live in today, is speed is a problem. When you look at all the venture capital that's moving in to create, the world of ICS and IoT and space exploration and aerospace and all those pieces mixed together, speed hurts us because, quite frankly, everybody wants to come out with the newest application, the newest technology that can be quickly adopted. And, if you're out there first, you may get broad market adoption. It doesn't mean you've done things right. And that's a big problem that we have today. When you look at it from the SBOM, piece, people are going to go pull, whatever code they can find that's going to fill a need that they, need in the software to run whatever it is they're selling, and they want to do it as quickly as possible. So it may not be something they've explored thoroughly. It may meet the functionality, but it may not meet a security requirement. If it's going to get them out to market ahead of, one of their, would-be competitors, then it's problematic. And many of the issues we see today, in the security world is specifically tied to, I want to be first.
I want to be first, I want to be out, and I don't always put time on security. Like aerospace in general is very complex. There's a lot of applications, a lot of things happening. If I'm going to generate all these SBOMs, wouldn't that create a new problem? How are we going to save them and manage them?
Bingo.
That's absolutely a problem. But the other side of that problem, and both Tony and Michael that talked about it a minute ago, is the fact that right now you've got such a disparate mix of who's doing SBOMs and who's not doing SBOMs. You've got a mixture of commercial manufacturers of software, even up to the big software development houses, and I won't name any on the screen here. But some of them are starting to do SBOMs and some of them are not. You get open source about zero SBOMs, and that's a real problem, both from a vulnerability perspective as well as from a licensing perspective, if you want to talk about one of the 8 domains of the CISSP. So it's really problematic when you try to put all of these things together, and yet to be agile and to move forward with speed and velocity and try to be the first one out there with the new products and at the lowest cost. Sometimes you're driven to incorporating things that you don't and can't get complete SBOM on. And that's part of the problem that we're just going to have to deal with and figure out what's the approach that we want to take, what amount of risk are our customers, be they commercial or private aerospace, whether they're a space company like Elon Musk's or Jeff Bezos are running. It's all in the amount of risk that they want to accept when they're accepting partial inputs of the SBOMs, because then it makes it difficult to evaluate the risk that's there in that software. that's not necessarily confined to just open source software.
Agree. So I'm wondering, beside a lot of information in the SBOM, what other hurdles can be in effectively implementing the values through software transparency? Michael, maybe you can tap to this topic and express what you think.
So a lot of we've kind of already started talking about, and it's the operationalization of it, right? You have field engineers and field mechanics that are working on systems that don't have access to the SBOMs. They have access to the system they're repairing or they're working on. And honestly, those integrations and those upgrades to me are really the highest risk, because we can all build a plane from scratch. We can all make it the way we want to. It's after it's been flying for 10 years, it needs to be repaired, and we've changed technology. Those SBOMs will fall off, right? Based off the things that we've talked about. Centralized management. Where are we going to find these? Who's actually going to have it? Will it be accessible to these engineers that are repairing the airplane out in the field, right? Or will that recall to take the plane down, full outage for the business, and then replace that airplane? So it actually could cause additional work if we don't figure out some of these other key factors. Getting the data is the easy part, I think. It literally is keeping that data alive and maintaining that process as they change with the technology that's moving so fast that we've brought up.
Tony, Chris?
Yeah, if I could add to that, my time on the NASA Advisory Council was pointed out to me. If you look at, some of our probes that are out there today, Voyager, we had conversations about this in the public realm. I'm not talking out of turn here. And it's fascinating to me, when you look at, how do you update those systems? How do you update the code on those? They were sent out in 1977. So think about what Michael just said there, and how do you do that? You can't, so instead you've got to put mitigation plans in place to ensure that they can't be attacked, even though there may be vulnerabilities in those systems, because you simply don't have access to them anymore. And when you apply this to, aviation, and you look at that, I've spent a lot of time traveling around the globe, and there are many places where, I would avoid simply because I did not trust the structure in a specific city in a specific country. So because, didn't know if they had the same requirements, to work on flights and the same level of access to much of this technology to keep pace with, some of the changes for maintaining this aircraft. So, so it's just something to think about, because it is problematic, today, before we even started down this SBOM path. And now as you try to look at the software and track it and understand it, it adds a lot of complexity, to maintaining systems that are out there for a multitude of years. ICS space is just as bad.
Yeah, if I could add just a little bit to that, from thinking about even global positioning systems and their use in navigation on automobiles, airplanes, boats, it doesn't matter. It's all the same basic technology. And yet today it's still susceptible to some sort of GPS interference. And it's also, I'm not really sure that I would want Garmin or any of the other major avionics manufacturers to be doing an update while I'm flying the airplane, because that could have unintended consequences. So, and then the other part that Michael talked about a little bit ago is, how do you maintain that SBOM for the long term? For example, I bought a Dodge Hellcat, and I took it down after the warranty had been violated in other ways. I took it down to my local speed shop, and I had them reprogram my engine computer to hype it up and go beyond the normal power settings that are authorized by the manufacturer. Who generates an SBOM for that? And the same thing could be the engine control unit in your Learjet engine. So who's taking care of that, so that that when you bought that car, you bought that airplane, that you can maintain it, because now the software is no longer different, but you have no way of knowing it. So I think that it's a good subject that needs to be explored.
Sounds like a use case for blockchain technology, but we're not going to dive in there right now. Tony and Chris and Michael, you brought interesting points. If something was created 30 years ago, it was probably written in a different language that people use right now or widely adopted. And I guess if I have a company right now that will create SBOMs, I'm going to use the modern technology because I want to have the 80-20 rules and fit many companies. So what I do is the plane that was done 30 years ago and was written on, I don't even know which language it was written, the code. Would it support it? Do I need to have a special SBOM studios companies for aircraft?
Essentially, that's what you end up creating, right? You create exceptions. You're creating exceptions for a new idea moving forward, but you have to take in that historical aspect because planes are still flying that are 30 years old, right? Trains are still going, even some vehicles. But without having those exceptions to make those included, then you end up with, quite honest, manufacturers going with the grandfathered solutions, right? Because that's the other alternative. We either create an exception with the grandfather says these 30-year-old equipment, it doesn't apply to this. We are moving forward. Then we see the manipulation of the market with, say, unscrupulous businessmen that will go down that path. I don't know if there's an actual fix to say this is mandatory across all things. It's a great idea. I've been on the other side of trying to enforce those and educate engineers on how to do it. So in theory, it's a good idea to have regulatory to make somebody do it. But at the end of the day, it just comes down to the engineer essentially doing his job, which is what we're kind of all talking about. Like I said, this links back to risk management and risk assessments back in the early days. We're just calling it something different.
Here. No, planes that are fly for 30 years probably were sold to other countries as well. Completely legit. Are we tapping into problems in international affairs? Do we want to give our SBOM to a different European country or not European country?
Well, I don't know. When you buy orange juice, do you change the label of its ingredients when you send it to another country? Because at that point, it's cost of goods. It's no longer private, right? And should the SBOM and ingredients follow it?
It's an interesting discussion.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so
I say yes as well. I mean, if this is, if you're flying that plane into, other countries' airports, and obviously many of them are, then you need that plane, maintained there as well. And, a software problem is, probably just as likely as a potential hardware problem. And many times you're going to load new hardware that requires, the software along with it. So that is going to be important, for people to have the same processes, methodologies, and the same understanding, of that supply chain as it goes into a system. Now, invariably, someone may not need to know, all the suppliers of software or some software being, added to a new component in, pick, Djibouti. It doesn't matter where you're at. The point is that, they may not need all of that, but nevertheless, they're going to have to understand some level of componency in the software so they can load it, maintain it, troubleshoot it, and ensure that that plane is, reliable as it takes off and heads to its next destination.
Chris?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I'd even go one step further and say that all of the maintenance spaces, say, for example, we have a big maintenance facility, a couple of them here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and a lot of the other major cities also have maintenance points for their aircraft. And all of those people who work in those maintenance facilities make changes to the aircraft, and they have to know what is in that software. If they're going to be changing from one box to another, they have to know that the software is the same. Otherwise, they're going to plug it in, and the guy's going to go to fly a regional approach somewhere, and he's not going to have the right software uploaded in it because they had no way of knowing. So, yeah, I think it's vital.
Is that should be a secure way to actually transfer such information and back to kind of how do I save all this information and where?
I think you mentioned blockchain earlier.
Good luck. You catch me on this. Okay. Maybe we'll create a company right now, SBOM and blockchain. We'll do the first one right now.
Well, as seen with crypto, though, blockchain can be hacked.
Yeah.
So talking about hacking, I'm wondering, we actually have a question from the audience, and I'm wondering, because we spoke about connected infrastructure, we spoke about connected planes, talk about not unsupervised, but basically helicopters that fly by themselves. Can I, in theory, hack an aircraft? Thank you. Untouchable for the question?
From a theoretical standpoint, anything's possible. Once you have engineering, a lot of the limitations that prevent us from hacking some of these control systems are vendor intellectual property and how they interface with those systems. I can speak from aviation to boats and to trains. All of them have their own proprietary software for their engineers when they interact. Now, the downside is when you talk about an SBOM and you're releasing that information, that's the Pandora's box that you're opening, because historically we didn't secure these softwares. They were left open. So if they're published out there on the web and you can access the systems and know how to do it, I mean, I say know-how, admin. We're not talking high-end security here. Then you can interface and have a very little knowledge base to execute this. So that can they be hacked? In theory, anything can be hacked if you can get your hands on it, right? Enough motivation, enough of time, you're going to break it. So nothing's impervious. Back to our joke about blockchain, crypto is crackable, right? It's a matter of finding the right pieces to tie together and the research around it. To this point, while we're talking about SBOMs, manufacturers have kept that fairly tight. It leaks out periodically, but you can't just go give me the full blueprint and the software that's on XYZ airplane.
I would like to add, if I could, that I completely agree with everything that Michael just said, but I would add that it's highly unlikely. The level of sophistication and dedication to getting that done, would be significant. And on the other side of that, there's also for especially many of the older flights, there's a lot of things you can do to disable any potential adversary that manages to break into those systems. You could disable a lot of that functionality. A little more difficult on the newer ones that are primarily everything's run by software. And when you look at some of the infotainment systems as well, there's some problems there, but the vast majority of those have some pretty decent separation, between them. So yes, I agree. I just think it's highly unlikely, and I think everybody in the panel knows I'm catching a plane as soon as we jump off this webinar, and it's not a concern for me. I fly a lot of miles, at least pre-pandemic did, and it's never been a concern for me.
So there's some Hollywood stuff that we've all seen on TV and we've heard about, and misinformation and whatnot. You always have to also consider, what is the motivation when you start talking about hacking an airplane? It's to down it. So if you're on the airplane hacking it, the probability of that happening would be right up there with a suicide bomber. All right. Remotely doing it, the systems, although they're intertwined or interconnected, it's going to take substantially more effort than it would to have a kinetic attack. And that's the thing, is like sometimes you just have to ask, can it be hacked? Sure. What's the probability? And is there an easier way to achieve the chaos that you want to achieve versus spending 6 months to a year doing a bunch of research? Just go blow the plane up. I mean, it's a lot easier.
So with all the discussion about software transparency and SBOM, is it actually save money for someone, or is it just a requirement to be more secure, more transparent?
I think that the trend is going to be in two directions. For the first place, the trend from a major system integrator's perspective, whether it's for Cessna or Lockheed Martin or General Motors and the ilk, is that you need to have that transparency in order to save yourself time, because someone else is providing you with that complete provenance of the software, which includes vulnerability and everything else. So that's saving you time and cutting down on the cost of development. And so if you do it with all of your software and everybody that's providing you with the software does the same thing, then it becomes very easy to just subsume their known SBOM for the version that you're incorporating into your software into your SBOM, and then providing the complete source or the complete history to your customers. And so that's going to be good information from them when they're trying to troubleshoot problems and isolate it down to a certain component of the software, for example.
I think there's a cost savings associated to the liability as it comes to knowingly having vulnerability software that can cause loss of life. At the end of that is insurance companies and litigation. So if people don't want to look at it from a standpoint of the impact of life, the impact of their assets, they can also look at the cost savings post when you have to pay out insurance because you decided to leave Log4j on the thing and somebody exploited it or whatever the case may be. We haven't had a whole lot of software exploits that have been directly related to attacks publicly. We know they occur, but most of them have been Hollywood attacks. Look at what I did, check this out. Or we have full denial of service, as we did with GPS over across the pond, where they wiped out all GPS for, was it the Bering Strait, and no ships could move. So outside that, full denial of service, actual hacks on airplanes, making them dip or fly or do loop-de-loos, that's just, it's not practical, nor is it really a viable path at this point.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think if you look at this across the board, and I agree with everything Chris and Michael both said about this, I would add one other piece from a specific defender perspective, and obviously, the cybersecurity team does not make up an entire corporation. They exist for the corporation. But from that perspective, it can provide economic benefits. If you wrap your arms around this and the industry embraces it as a whole, and there's a new CVE out about, this library of software that's, got a vulnerability in it that's remotely exploitable, with that SBOM and the SBOM of SBOMs, as your suppliers provide them to you, it could be a simple query into a system to know you're vulnerable or you're not vulnerable. Versus what happened with like Log4j, I'll use again, where, am I vulnerable? And in most corporations, large enterprises, like, I have no idea. So let's get at it and figure out if we are or not. So I think there will be economic benefits, but there's a tremendous amount of things that we have to wrap our arms around today, to be able to track this and build a structure for it and put the right policies in place and the right guidelines, to make it easier for people to implement and track across not just aviation, but all industries.
Thank you. We're actually done with our topics we want to discuss, so we're going to bring more questions from the audience. And we have one question about SBOM, and if you're actually asking the suppliers for the SBOM. I know a lot of people started to work on SBOM internally, but it's quite hard to take care of the third-party management and ask them for SBOM. So I would like to learn more about what you guys do. Thank you, Casey, for your question.
I've seen it with a couple of my customers with the whole vendor management and government work. Having them produce, though, from the vendor, it seems to be painful. It's been, I can tell you, they've wrapped it into their vendor management to where it's part of the questionnaires that go out. But unfortunately, the other side is still a little lost as to what's asking because, quite honest, they don't have full inventory of all their software that's included with it. So it's
they may not have the tools to actually create the SBOMs as well.
Well, exactly, right? It's so new in its genesis that a lot of times that question's going to somebody that doesn't even know, A, what are you asking? B, how am I going to achieve this for you, right? Because they want to do vendor management. They want to get that information. At least the salesman does. Now it's just a matter of pulling that together. Centralized sharing and then centralized a standard for what an SBOM looks like for delivery probably would be the critical path to make it easier. But right now, everybody's kind of doing their own thing. It's a CSV, it's a JSON dump, it's an inventory that we pulled off here. It's a planner for what the software would be like, maybe not what it actually turned out to be. So we have all these pieces, but it seems to be the process and the overarching operations of it still has some opportunities.
Yeah, I would add, I think that's a great question, Cassie. And I think that when you look at it across the board, we're just in such the early stages of this that, you really can't make for most areas procurement decisions based on that. I've had many conversations about it, and you see people recoil a little bit sometimes when that conversation starts. It's like, what, you're asking me for what? So I think it's an important thing, and it really gets a good conversation started and can help you have that conversation about your suppliers, on what they're doing for risk management, because all of this, rolls into risk management, and it's an important, point to think about. I think it will be a very large inclusive piece in procurement decisions down the line, but I think we're still a couple of years out before we see a real structure for that, where it's built, designed, and people have, even recommended guidelines in this area.
Yeah, I'd agree with what he said. Absolutely. It's too early in the process to be able to go out to all of your vendors, whom some of them you've got multi-year contracts with, building software, and ask them to do something that they have no idea how to do, and you really don't have a good template of what to provide them so that they know exactly what it is that you're looking for. I have gone back to vendors of software packages, commercial, and for example, and especially in the AI software world, where they look at you and their eyes cross. It's easier to train an AI system to do what it's going to do than it is for them to figure out how to get the components. They have no idea. They look at you like you're nuts.
So we still have a lot of education to do in the industry in this part.
We have a lot of education to do. I totally agree with that.
I can't count oh, I'm sorry, Chris.
No, fine.
I was just going to say, I can't count the number of times I've sent people to NTIA's webpage, that's focused on the introduction of SBOM, that simply didn't even know what I was talking about.
So is this NTIA responsibility to teach, or whose responsibility to teach other people?
I think it's everyone, every expert in the field's responsibility to kind of push this forward so that it's on people's radar. So they're thinking about it, talking about it, and starting to think about, all right, let me go back as a CTO and look to see what's in our library of software. What are in my supplier's library of software? Where is that coming from? People haven't thought about it before. I mean, at best, somebody would ask, where's your core code developed? But they wouldn't, what's in that core code? That's a really critical question that is not asked today.
Right. You've got to figure out how to negotiate for getting the same price that you were paying before for that piece of software. Once they realize that they have to go do all this work to fulfill a contract with you, they may just tell you that they don't want to do business with you anymore. It's a tough place to be right now. And I think that filling out it's time to go, Tony.
Or it's on fire.
It's a fire alarm at my hotel.
Wow. So we have few other questions that are not related. Sorry, folks, we're not going to talk about blockchain and how to reconstruct a pickup file on this particular live show. I do have a question. If you had a magic wand, what will you change or introduce in SBOM and software transparency and aviation, or in general? Who wants to start? Michael?
I'd say from an SBOM standpoint, with a magic wand, straight from Hogwarts, I'd want, if we could turn around and have the system, the SBOM being a living system that follows, say, the vehicle of question, because I think it goes beyond just aviation. But that way, when those in-field engineers are actually working on something that ties back to operations, to me, a clipboard or whatnot's going to be part of the failure of this. It'll be a risk assessment when we built it, and we just won't follow it through. We have a long history of leaving things up to engineers of what's vulnerable versus what's not vulnerable, which is, or if we should or shouldn't apply a patch, or if it should be included. That automated system to where we can pull that almost like a bill of lading of what the build out is in its current state would be a huge gap closer. But that's easier said than probably done. We struggle with Windows patch inventories, so I couldn't imagine trying to do a plain inventory.
Yeah, I think that the idea has been floated around in the Agile world about even doing continuous SBOMs at each step of the DevSecOps process, and keeping those, and then being able to compare and follow through with what evolved with your software before it was actually released. And that's going to be a pretty insurmountable task in the beginning anyway, to spend your money trying to figure out, how do I do that, and what is it going to look like?
Back in the olden days, I'd say olden days, 20 years ago, banking would require you to put your software in equity. All right. And it'd be held independently, and then you could have your code reviewed. And the whole premise of that was if your code disappeared or if it had a vulnerability. That's a practice that has gone away. The independent review, the escrow aspect of putting your source code and having it stored and independently reviewed just isn't something you hear about as much nowadays in risk assessments or vendor management. And that actually might be one of those stepping stones of not making the manufacturer necessarily responsible for doing the SBOM, but having independent consumer reporting, which has been a topic that's been brought up numerous times, not just me today, but other organizations.
I would say it's also related to outside of aviation and things that are designed to run for a very long period of time without updates. When you look at everything else in the enterprise world and especially the consumer world, everything gets updated whether we need it or not on a frequent basis, and it'd be very, very difficult on the code side, to keep up with that and store that in escrow. I think back to your original question there, Evgeniy, is if I could wave a magic wand, I think the SBOM side would be a great place to have again magic wand wave, so we can skip all the training and have AI focus on this and immediately tell us, the provenance of everything in our code base across the board. In reality, there would be tremendous amount of work, putting those structures out there and training the AI to do that. So, but I think it could be an interesting area for a startup, to focus on, that's, got some expertise in artificial intelligence. So look at the code and tell us, where did it come from? What vulnerabilities in it, tie it to MITRE CVE and look, tie it to MITRE attack, a UC attack paths. I think there's a lot that could be done there, but we're a long way down the road from that, unless, you hand out these magic wands.
Siri, is my plane safe?
So we basically want an AI fairy that will understand SBOM and understand what's happening. We're actually going to save you answers and we'll review in a year. Let's see what somebody did or not, just to see if any of this come to reality. Meanwhile, thank you very much for being here. Thank you everybody that watched us today. It was very fun to talk to you today. Chris, Michael, Tony, it was really, really amazing answers and topics. I'm very, very happy to be here. If you guys watching us right now or later on, please don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you in the future.
All right.
Thank you
for having us.